Hi there, everybody who's joining us on the Great Lakes Roadtrip 2022. We, at this stage where you will be seeing this, we are in Sault Ste. Marie. Unfortunately, for this trip, we're not able to cross the border into the United States to visit with our American partners in person. So unfortunately, we can't be on the shores of Lake Michigan, but we are able to connect with one of our partners, Shed Aquarium, virtually. So I have here Dr. Austin Happel, and you can see behind him this beautiful landscape, the city of Chicago and beautiful Lake Michigan. So we are able to visit virtually at the very least. Dr. Happel, thank you so much for being with us. It's really a pleasure to be able to connect in this way. I guess to start off with, would you mind sort of introducing yourself, what it is you do for Shed Aquarium?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I am a research biologist at the Shed Aquarium. We are located on the banks or on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. My research program focuses on how fish live in our cities. So I'm really interested in how fish live within the Chicago River, which actually flows behind some of the high rises you can see behind me. And the reason it's really interesting is we generally study fish in their more natural habitats, and studying fish in the opposite of that in an area that's super urbanized and super built up leads to a lot of interesting questions related to, like, what do they find as ideal spawning habitat? What do they eat? Or where do they just hang out in the river? And so we're interested in trying to look at all of those sort of questions and help connect Chicagoans and the greater Great Lakes community to some of the fishes that also call our cities home.
That's such an interesting idea. A lot of the students who are joining us on the road trip, like myself, live in the Greater Toronto area, which is itself on the shores or banks of Lake Ontario. So I see a lot of similarities between our two cities. But a lot of the students joining us are Canadian and might not be familiar with Chicago. It sounds like water is a really important part of your city. Like, it's really present. You know, you're right on Lake Michigan. The Chicago River runs through your city. Like, are you able to tell us a little bit more about water in Chicago or Chicago's waterways?
Yeah, let's start at the beginning of Chicago itself, because water is crazy important to why we're even here and why our city got situated. Chicago is set on what's called a continental divide. So when water falls on one part of the city, it flows towards the Illinois River, which then goes to the Mississippi River and out to the Gulf of Mexico. And when water falls on the other side of the city, it flows into Lake Michigan, which then goes to Huron, Erie, Ontario, and out through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that water says hi to you guys and then moves on out to the Atlantic. What Chicago ended up doing, though, is kind of separating or building across that continental divide. So we kind of broke how that natural system worked. And we did that so that we could bring commerce and shipping and move people up and down the rivers between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin. This happened actually in the 1800s and was kind of pushed forward so we can connect places like Quebec and Montreal and Toronto to places along the Mississippi River, especially things like New Orleans, and get those kind of two French connections going. So that makes the water that is within the Chicago River super interesting, because it's kind of this mixture of Lake Michigan water, but then also everything we deal with that comes from the surface water. Toronto is built in the same way, in that their surface water will go down into a pipe that connects with all the water coming out of your houses and buildings. That water normally goes to a wastewater treatment plant and then into a local river.
Yeah.
That happens here in Chicago, as well as almost all the Great Lakes cities. That's called a combined sewer overflow system. And the reason they call it that is that if it rains too much, that whole process can get overwhelmed And instead, that water goes straight into the rivers. So you'll have issues with combined sewer overflow events causing untreated waste and stormwater to end up in your water bodies. We have that too. And that's another whole interesting aspect of these urban waterways, is trying to figure out, what does that do for fish? It's putting in a lot of nutrients that probably fuels a food web. And that food web can support all sorts of things. But with that can come other things. We might have pharmaceuticals that end up in the water. We might have salts that come off of our roads that end up in the water. And so all these questions are things that are really interesting to talk about and get people thinking about, because it affects their local environment. And so I would say water is also important to you guys.
Oh, definitely. And we're certainly, I'm actually not a native Torontonian. I grew up along the Ottawa River, which is connected eventually to the Great Lakes system. But I think we're quite lucky to live on the banks of one of the Great Lakes. It's a hugely important resource. So this is so interesting that we're from these different cities. We're quite far apart, but perhaps have very similar connections to our water. What is the impact of the city of Chicago and its huge population of people? Like, what is the overall impact of that on the river and on Lake Michigan?
Yeah, so as the city grew from like a few thousand back in the 1800s to now several million, what we had to do is figure out ways to get rid of surface water. When it rains heavily, it has a tendency to flood in flat areas like Chicago. So what we tried to do is get that water out of here as quickly as possible. What that means is we built canals. So what we call the Chicago River is really a canal system. And a canal has flat vertical walls and a flat bottom.
Right.
And that way water can just go and get out of here really fast. And so that's one of the biggest things you'll notice about our rivers or waterways within our city, is that they're pretty streamlined in order to help get that water out of here. What that does is reduce all sorts of habitat. So there's no real overhanging vegetation. There's no big boulders for fish to hide behind. There's not like roots or plants growing out of it that fish can hide in. And so it's pretty habitat limited. By water flows, over 70% of the flow of the Chicago River is actually being pushed from the effluent of wastewater treatment plants. So water that's been cleaned, been processed, and then gets pushed into the canal system is actually what's causing all of the flows. And so we don't have a normal like flowing river that might have like rapids in some parts or slow sections in other parts. It's all slow. Okay. And then the other thing is with that there's parts of wastewater effluent that can't be removed. We have a super hard time removing salts from water. If you ever hear of like a desalination plant, they're not super common because it's so hard to do and so costly. And so the effluent can come with some parts that are really difficult to remove, and thus the ecosystem has to kind of deal with them as our population grows. And so those are some ways that we directly affect kind of the environment. I think all of those kind of combine or come together to make people not really want to interact with the system either. And so it's really hard for us to get people to go out and go kayaking or go fishing or like walk along the waterways or the riverways, despite their living ecosystem, and they're doing pretty well. We have lots of fish in them. We have lots of birds feeding on those fish or living in the waterway. It's a pretty healthy ecosystem. So that's another aspect that like we don't think about, is how people don't consider it a resource as they're in these like big cities. That's like you can go out and go kayaking, you can exercise on them, you can walk around and run alongside them and stuff. So
right. It's almost, and I think that happens here too. I think we, can get very wrapped up in our urban existence, forget that the lake is even there, but it's this wonderful connection in our city to nature, like you said, I always say you don't have to go to the Toronto Zoo to encounter nature, because it's in and around our city, and it's certainly on the banks of Lake Ontario. But I also understand that Shed Aquarium, and a big part of your work and your research with them, is sort of about potentially improving something like the river and making it more hospitable to local species. So can you talk a little bit about what the aquarium is doing? I heard something about floating islands, or like man-made islands.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I feel like Avatar has floating islands in it, or some of those movies. Yeah, one thing we're trying to do is add habitat back to these waterways. We know that a channelized or a canal system doesn't really provide much for fish. Fish love, or I guess I like to say fish love to play hide and seek. They like to hide in things. They like to go behind stuff. They love structure. And so adding these floating islands or floating wetlands to the system can kind of provide that. What they are these floating mats of coconut fiber. Within those mats, we can plant native wetland plants. So below the surface of the water is all the roots of those plants. And within those roots, bacteria and algae will grow, zooplankton can feed on those, and then fish can feed on those zooplankton. They can also hide within those roots because the roots are pretty free flowing and provide some of that structure. Above the surface, though, the wetland plants, they're native. So when they flower, a lot of native pollinators come by. So we see lots of bees and butterflies, moths coming around. And so that's one way that we're trying to add habitat here. But we're also doing some more virtual or computerized work, where a lot of my time is spent telling the computer to do something with Excel documents to then produce answers. And one thing we're trying to do is see, like, how has the fish community changed over multiple decades, and then what water quality parameters maybe predict that. So then we can say, like, oh, this improvement to wastewater management worked, but it maybe took 5-10 years for us to kind of see an effect of it.
Right.
And since we did see that effect, that's something we either want to promote elsewhere or maintain in the future as things kind of progress, and as we get more and more people in our cities, or as climate change starts to affect rainfall amounts and snow amounts and things. So am I right in saying you're kind of looking into like the history of local fishes? Yeah, 100%. So yeah. We're definitely looking at how have they changed over multiple decades, and the history of like their abundances, what species were here, how those species are changing. So.
That's really neat. So I read a little bit about the floating island project before coming to talk to you. And I think that I saw that you in particular had found like evidence of spawning of fish laying their eggs in these newly constructed habitats. And what's the significance of that, or why is that so exciting?
Well, yeah. So one of my interests during my research projects is trying to figure out where and when are different fish spawning within the river, because finding the offspring of a certain species means several things have come together. That the mom and dad of that offspring were able to survive to be maturity and to reproduce. And to survive to that means water quality must be pretty good. It means they must be finding enough food. They must be finding shelter. And they must be relatively happy if they're then going to reproduce. But then an egg is crazy sensitive. So for the egg to then survive to be a baby fish, and then us to find that baby fish is very telling of how not only water quality, but habitat in the ecosystem has improved. And so we're looking to see what we find around these floating wetlands. And we're finding that there's a decent number of fish and fish species that are spawning in these areas. And you can imagine, like, if you were to take a cross-section view of what that floating wetland looks like, it's a mat that then has a bunch of dangly, feathery roots in it. And those roots are going to be real attractive to fish trying to find a spot to hide their eggs. And so they can put their eggs up in those roots, or hopefully just like spawn near it and hope the eggs go into the roots. But that'll provide some protection for those eggs from other predators and from some maybe poor water quality events. And seeing the fish larva or the baby fish in those areas is really cool, and a great story about how these are providing some new spawning habitats in these urban systems.
Right. It's like the proof of other things working the way they should be.
It's like the proof of a lot of other things coming together to work, right? Like, so
that is exciting. And like, I'm curious, what kinds of local fishes are you observing spawning in the river?
We're kind of focused on the Chicago River itself, which is a very particular section. And so far we've found upwards of 20 species. Those species are primarily native species, or species that should be here, or that we would expect to be here. The invasive ones, or the ones that would be classified as invasive, have been here for quite a long time. Common carp are probably the most prevalent one, which you guys also have common carp.
Yep.
They can live in almost anything, but still them spawning is somewhat telling of the ecosystem can support life. And then we're seeing some other species in the area. Some really common ones are members of the minnow group and some native species of the minnow family. Minnows are very picky about what water quality they live in, and often pretty picky about what they eat. So seeing things like mimic shiner and spot-fin shiner and golden shiner in the area is telling to those aspects of the environment. We're also seeing species like gizzard shad, which are our native sort of planktivore.
Cool.
So seeing those guys spawn means that there's a lot of zooplankton in the area, and that zooplankton is telling us that the food web is operating at a high sort of frequency or capacity or efficiency. As zooplankton have a quick turnaround time, so to be able to feed a big planktivore, you need a lot of zooplankton going around. And then we're also seeing bluegill or sunfish. So there's several within the sunfish group, several species, and they're all pretty mean to each other when they set up territories and nests. So to see them spawning and to see several species means that they must be finding their perfect little nest location and being able to find multiples of it, because they're territorial. So if you're going to have multiple individuals spawning, you need the space and the habitat quality for that. And so those are telling us that habitat is also pretty available, at least for those guys to spawn. And so that can give you some idea of some of the things that are coming together to produce these species.
So it's fantastic, like to see that the variety of fishes that are taking advantage of this I guess manufactured habitat,
built environment,
but it's because I love that each species and its unique sort of role and behaviors are providing you with all of that fantastic information about the different things that are working. So that's really exciting. That's fantastic. And my understanding is that the community is actually sort of helping you in not just potentially planting or expanding this habitat, but it is kind of collecting data for you in community science. So can you speak a little bit to the role of Chicagoans in this sort of venture?
Yeah, Chicagoans. Well, one of the big ways that we have citizen scientists help us is during our Kayak for Conservation days. We have a program that runs throughout the summer where we take local Chicagoans who sign up out in a kayak. They learn about the history of the Chicago River, and then they travel to the Wild Mile location where those floating wetlands are. And along that area, they pick up and quantify and describe the amount of litter they're seeing. So then we can kind of look over the months of the summer, how does like the composition of floating litter change. We can also start to identify sources so that maybe we can take corrective actions to maybe stop some of the influx of waste that's going into the river. When they get to the Wild Mile location, they are observing and counting different bird species, different turtle species, and mammal species, so we can see over time how has the environment above the water sort of changed as these islands build out and as we get more and more habitat there. They'll take a few minutes to sit by the islands and count pollinators. So they'll count the number of bees and wasps and butterflies that they see. And then they, at the end, on their way back, they actually pull up these little minnow traps to see what sort of minnows they find in the area. So they might find, often they find a lot of crayfish, they might find some minnow species, or they might find some of the bluegill. And so we're using all their hands and eyes and ears to help us collect data and kind of be able to talk about the potency of this restoration activity in an urban system like that.
That's amazing. And do you think that somebody who does that, who participates in this program, do you think that this is also maybe kind of changing the perspective about the river? You know, that someone would experience sort of the biodiversity of animals that are coming, you know, to live here, that are pollinating here. Like, is it changing perspectives, changing minds?
Yeah, definitely. You'd be surprised at how many people come out and, one, have never kayaked. That's a common thing. So that's not super surprising. But two, have never set foot like that close to the Chicago River, like not gone to any of our parks that are nearby, not gone to a pier or something. So just simply to get them out and recreating is changing some people's minds. But then to get them over to where that Wild Mile location is and see the number of birds that are out there, see the number of plants that are growing and the turtles that are there, really changes and shifts perspective of what a resource we kind of have flowing through the city and how that resource can maybe be used recreationally.
Right.
There's a decent amount of research out there that shows just being able to go out in an environment and enjoy nature can really sort of change your outlook on the day and how you feel and make you happier, and actually change health outcomes too. So make you a little bit healthier if you're out in the environment. So not only are we changing perspectives, but hopefully changing outcomes.
That's awesome. So these volunteers they're helping you in your research. They're helping the ongoing restoration of the river, and the river is giving back. I just what a beautiful relationship. My last question for you is, so many of the students joining us, I think so many of them are nature lovers, are animal lovers. Throughout this road trip, we're learning more and more about the Great Lakes, about the region, about the species that live here. Do you have any recommendations for sort of how the average citizen of the Great Lakes region, what can we do to make a more positive impact, like on this resource that we share, these species that we love collectively? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, well, one of the first things I start with when people ask how can they help is to recommend that they go out and use the resource. So whether that means walking in a park along the riverway, or maybe fishing or kayaking or taking photos or photo documenting species or something like that. Using the resource is actually a great way to help get funding to help protect that resource, because the more people that are using it and talking about it, the more we can actually fight to save it. And also, if you get out and start using a resource, probably not the first or fifth time that you're using it, but maybe the 10th time you'll pick up a can that you see. Maybe the 20th time you'll pick up a whole bunch of trash that you see. Maybe after using the resource 50 times, you'll start signing petitions to help maybe restore areas. So like, it's sort of a stepwise process of how you can get involved in those areas. So that's maybe the more organic way of kind of helping things. More direct actions is to search for any group that's maybe friends of the park or the river or the Great Lakes or something. They'll usually have some sort of stewardship events where you can go out and you can help pick up litter, or you can help talk to people about the organisms that live there, or you can learn maybe about how the ecosystem has changed.
Right.
And so they can get you connected in that way. For example, here we have Friends of the Chicago River, and they host these paddle and plant events where you can go out and directly help restore parts of the river by putting in plants that will live there for multiple years and hopefully grow and expand.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We're so glad to have made this connection with SHED and the important research that's being done there to make this connection with Lake Michigan, even through this virtual interface. So thank you, Dr. Happel. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. Thanks for chatting. Hopefully in the future we can show you around in person and continue this conversation about urban waterways.
I hope so. If the road trip proves successful, maybe we'll do it again next year, and maybe we can get out into a kayak or something. It's on the bucket list.
Awesome. Yeah, we'd love to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. Hi, good afternoon. How are you doing, Dr. Happel?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing very well. It's nice to see you again. Where are you today?
I'm in my office today instead of the office overlooking downtown Chicago.
Fantastic. And any good researcher's office complete with model fishes. I love it.
and a stuffed fish too.
So thank you, Maps, of course. So thank you so much for joining us. We just played our interview that we were able to conduct a few weeks ago, and we've had some questions coming in through our Padlet application throughout. So if you have a few minutes, we do have some questions for you.
Awesome.
So let me just take a look here. First and foremost, and I think this is a very important question, and the people really need to know, what is your favorite fish, or perhaps the favorite species that you work with?
Knew it. It's always a good one. My favorite group of fish are called sturgeon. So sturgeon are a fish that are considered really old or almost like living relics. They're unique in the freshwater fish world in that they don't have bones, they have cartilage, they are streamlined in shape, but in a way that presses them against the bottom of rivers, and they have a mouth that can vacuum up stuff. And so they're kind of cool. And if you come to SHED, you can actually feel them and feel what they feel like, and they feel like leather. And they have these like weird electric sensors that actually, I think, cause them to enjoy being like touched or felt by humans. They, even in the wild, they'll swim directly kind of up to you. It's super cool.
It's funny that you should list, that family of fishes, because our very first stop on the road trip was actually in Brockville, Ontario. We visited the Aquarium and we were introduced to their collection of lake sturgeon, and they are, must say, they're pretty fantastic. So I'm not surprised at all that would be your answer. Although now it sounds like we have to travel to SHED to be able to perhaps interact a bit more directly with them. That's really neat. So I have a great answer. Also my personal favorite fish. This next question is asking, for students who are watching and who are perhaps interested in pursuing a career in science or in conservation, do you have any advice or recommendations for pursuing that career path?
I mean, a good thing to say off the bat is that no one's path is straightforward. Everyone has a pretty windy path into the careers that they get into. And I generally say follow your interest and make sure that interest can be expressed with some sort of professor. So find a professor that you get along with and that does research that's of interest to you, and try to get your hands dirty helping them conduct that research, and that can start to open doors for you. And don't be afraid to find what doors you'd like to keep shut. I tell people to figure out both what you love and what you hate, and so that you don't end up heading down some pathway where you're stuck doing something you don't like. But as you go into through high school and doing career fairs and not career fairs, science fairs into college, try to seek out those opportunities to get your hands dirty with different projects.
So for you, would you say that your career started with a passion for fish or for freshwater?
I grew up on a small pond in Indiana, and instead of, I don't know, playing a lot of sports, I actually hung out a lot in the pond in my backyard and in the forest in my backyard. And then I went during high school, I worked quite a bit at a local pet store and helped run the aquarium section, and really enjoyed talking to people about the fish they have and the fish they could take home and why maybe some fish aren't a good idea. And so, yeah, I think it kind of started off young. I actually went to school thinking I'd get a business degree and open a pet store. And then that quickly changed when I found out you can have a career that involves being outside and enjoying nature.
Yeah, I think that's probably a common factor with the three of us on the road trip, you know, to have a job away in the office some of the time and in the lab some of the time, but also in the field some of the time. I think that's a common factor amongst our crew members, if you will. All right, these are some big questions. Have you seen differences in terms of individual species, I assume fish species, in their sort of behaviors in urban environments versus more wild environments?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there's a lot of factors that go on within an urban environment that maybe don't happen in a natural environment. One thing we're really interested in sort of pursuing, trying to get a better understanding of, is how fish respond to noise and boat noise and things. So do they, say on Labor Day, when everyone decides to rent a boat and go do stuff, do fish tend to hunker down and go away? That's something we don't really know a whole lot about. There's some evidence that within like harbors and stuff, we can start to see that. Similarly, things with light. So cities are bright. That light can also light up the water. And so we can see that that can sometimes start to affect the way that fish maybe search for spawning habitat or try to seek out a mate, and maybe what they might consider a good spot to put a nest versus a different spot. And so directly I haven't, but I'm really interested in some of these topics that maybe some other people have started to poke at, and how we can maybe start looking at that within the Chicago River in our downtown.
Again, just for those classrooms that are following, we're seeing wonderful connections day to day. Earlier in the week, we were in Ottawa talking about American eel and how light pollution in the capital region impacts kind of their migration. So it's wonderful to see these connections, you know, even on different bodies of water in different cities and different countries, but we're asking the same questions and kind of working toward the same, gathering the same data. So that's really interesting to see. And again, another big question, if you don't mind, have you noticed, or what have you noticed about how wildlife above the water? So you mentioned there are quite a few birds and mammals and invertebrates in the wild mile. How does that affect the ecosystems in the underwater or aquatic environment in the river?
Oh, interesting. How does life above the water, but specifically maybe animals, affect animals underneath the water?
I think that's the question.
Yeah, because we can go on and on about how habitat variables above the water, or us as humans, affect them, but other animals, that's an interesting question that I don't know if I have a great answer to. One thing we're noticing as fish populations come back and as we improve habitat, we are noticing more birds that are what's called piscivorous. So pice being fish and vorous meaning eat it. So birds that eat fish. Coming back to the different areas that we're trying to improve. So we're seeing a lot of, a common one people might know of are herons, or a group of fish or a group of birds that eat fish. We're seeing herons come back to areas, and so they'll pick off a lot of the prey fish. But what's great is to know that there's enough fish for them to want to be there. And so I don't really think that they have huge effects on, say, the fish populations, but they're telling us that fish populations are doing well enough that they're going to hang out here.
Right.
Same thing with some turtles. We're seeing some turtles coming back to the system and showing up more. And some of our questions are were they always there and now we just see them because they like come up on these floating wetlands that we've built, or are they coming because of the floating wetlands? And so that'll be a fun question to try to tease apart, but
right.
We're seeing more of those come back too.
Okay, so they're giving you, if anything, even more clues about life under the water.
And how, like, so all of those are predators of fish, who are then predators of like zooplankton, who are predators of algae. And so to feed all of those
right.
Trophic levels takes an incredible amount of energy. There's some estimate that about like 10% of what's consumed is actually integrated into the body for energy. So that's super inefficient. So to be able to feed a heron means that we've done a lot of cool stuff to support animals beneath it to lead up to that food chain and food web.
Now this next question, I will be honest, this is my question. And maybe you're asked this all the time and maybe you hate this question. Just a few days ago was St. Patrick's Day. And I was looking
at
where
this is going.
I saw some images of your Chicago River because I was editing our video together and I was looking for footage of the river. And it was this vibrant shade of green for St. Patrick's Day, which I guess is something that Chicago does every year, this fun way to celebrate. And I wondered, does that affect the fish? I'm sure you're asked this all the time.
It is a very common question that seems to have a seasonality to when it's asked. So one thing we can say right off the bat is when they dye the river, never have we seen, say, like a response from the ecosystem. We've never really seen, say, fish that aren't doing well within the waterway or invertebrates that aren't doing well within the waterway. But that doesn't mean that maybe they respond in a different way. Maybe they are able to sense it and swim out of the way and just go to a different area. Or alternatively, maybe they aren't responding at all and they don't notice it. We don't have great answers to that, but what we can say is it doesn't seem to be the biggest problem that we might have to be dealing with currently. So there's a lot of other issues that can happen. So like maybe periodically we'll have some sort of chemical spill and right away you'll see a response and that response is bad. We don't see that happening, to make that clear. So now the question is maybe what some of the maybe minor responses. Do they swim away? Do they not care? So
maybe, I don't know, maybe they're having a good day, just like everybody else in Chicago. But I understand there are definitely more pressing issues. And then, so I'm looking at my Padlet and I think we've answered most of the questions there. I would invite the classrooms that are watching. Now it's kind of a last call for questions if you have any. And apart from that, we would like to thank you so much for joining us for the initial interview. Thank you so much for coming back this afternoon and answering these live questions, because this week with this group of students who are watching, every time we present them with a new topic, they have absolutely been interested and they have had these great questions. Like, as you can tell, the caliber of question was very high today. We have a lot of curious students across Ontario watching. So we really appreciate you taking the time, being here in real time and answering their questions. All right, that was last call. I don't see any new ones. Is there anything that you would like to add? Anything that you'd like to tell us about Shed Aquarium before we call it a day?
I don't know if I have a whole lot more to add. I mean, we're fully open, welcoming guests. Come see the sturgeon, touch the sturgeon. And you can end up seeing some of the fish that actually live within the Chicago River within some of our exhibits, which is pretty cool to point out.
Absolutely. Sounds good. And like I said, if this road trip this year is a success, maybe next year when we have a little bit more liberty moving across the border, we would love to speak with you and meet with you in person, maybe see parts of the Wild Mile for ourselves. It's just such a fantastic project, and it sounds like it's already having very positive impact on the Chicago River. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk a little bit more about it. We hope that we can see you and talk to you again soon. And I guess that's it for now. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And yeah, that we can talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks for great questions.
All right, everyone. Just a reminder that it being Friday, we will not be broadcasting over the weekend, but we will be back Monday at 10 a.m., where we will have packaged a video to show you what we're getting up to in and around Lake Huron over the next 2 days. So we hope to see you back on YouTube at 10 a.m. on Monday. Thank you, everyone who's made the road trip just fantastic thus far. Remember that you can follow us, hashtag Great Lakes Road Trip 2022. Teachers, if your students are filling out their passports with fun and interesting drawings and factoids from these sessions, feel free to take pictures and show us. And once again, Dr. Happel, it's just been an absolute pleasure. And we'll wish everybody a good afternoon.